All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So I'm Andy Simnick. I am from the Art Institute of Chicago. So I'm an engineer turned consultant turned data guy turned leader of the finance and strategy teams at the museum. You have a lot of choices, and I appreciate you spending some time with me today to learn about how we've used Tableau, Alteryx, data, and a lot of good questions and intuition to really transform the museum in the last couple of years. And let's start out, who here has been to the Art Institute? Excellent, excellent. So we have very good favorability. People seem to like us. And has everybody heard of the Art Institute? It hasn't been there. Okay, fantastic. So we don't really need to get into what is the Art Institute. Sometimes conferences, we have to explain this a little bit. But we're an art museum. So we're an extremely venerable art museum. So we were founded in 1879 with the same mission that we have today. This building, right here, let's see. This is, we're still in this building. However, we've expanded quite a bit. Since the beginning, we've had a reputation for quality and scholarship, and we're the only major U.S. museum connected with a dedicated art school, and the School of the Art Institute is one of the best in the world. So we've grown. Now, today, by the numbers, we're about 1.5 million visits per year. Actually, I went to 1.7 million this past year due to the success of Van Gogh's bedrooms. We're 1 million square feet, which makes us the second largest museum in the U.S. We have about 30 exhibitions per year, extremely prolific, and that sets us apart from a lot of other art museums. We've been voted top 3 museum in the world in TripAdvisor since 2013. Number 1 in 2014, which I'll get into a little bit later in the presentation. And we've recently received both the largest gift of art in the museum's history and the largest cash gift in the museum history since starting this work, which is exciting. And we've seen double-digit annual growth in admissions revenue, which for our industry, we think puts us in a leadership position. So ultimately, though, it comes down to the art. So who here has seen this work before? And great, lots of hands. So what sets us apart as well is we have many, many, many iconic images. We don't have the largest collection, but we believe we have one of the most recognizable. So here we have the Seurat, one of the best sight lines in the museum, also a very significant part of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And American Gothic, which in our research is requested by visitors 3 times more than any other painting in the museum. We have Nighthawks, and then we've recently, going back to the gift of art, we've expanded our contemporary holdings, getting icons by Warhol, here Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein. And going forward, it's a big part of our long-term vision to continue collecting contemporary with the same eye that we've collected icons of the past. So, but enough about art. So why does a museum need data? So we're a complex organization, right? So are we a tourist destination? Are we an art collection? Are we a foundation? Are we an educational organization? Are we a retailer? We have a museum shop. The fact is we're all of these things. And it all starts with the collection. So that's the commonality. We have the staff and the buildings to support it. We produce a visitor experience, educational programming, a series of exhibitions, and scholarly research to a number of different audience groups. So students, patrons, our visitors overall, and visitors from all over the world, collectors, scholars, but it all still comes back to the collection. And when we think about using data, it helps us understand the different business models that exist between all of those different components. So overall, a museum is super complex, but what we've done in our work over the past several years is try to deconstruct it into sections that we can break off, ask questions, rationally understand through data, and ultimately strengthen our organization, both financially as well as our ability to deliver our mission. So as a museum and as a nonprofit in general, we face other challenges that not all of you may in your organization. So we don't have a single metric for success. For us, it's less about how far can we push that bottom line with the least amount of resources. It's how far can we take our actions while maintaining a solid bottom line. So it's partly financial, partly process-driven. There are ways to measure, but not everybody focuses on that same end objectives. So lots of balancing. We have significant resource constraints. We are lucky. We are a very large museum, but in the grand scheme of things, we are still a relatively small business, so about $100 million top line, which for some of your organizations is tiny, some it'll be big. But again, it's not, we can't invest tons of money and time into analytics. And we're an art museum. We have some of the best people in the world at what they do, but we have limited analytic experience. A lot of us, even those of us in the museum that are on the cutting edge of this type of work, still are learning as we go. And we, like many organizations, have fragmented systems. I think it's almost an extreme amount. We have great data ranging all the way back from our museum's founding, but we go from state-of-the-art cloud-based databases all the way to paper records that are being scanned in as we go. So it's how do we take that entire bolus of knowledge and bring it into something usable. So we'll talk a little about how we've used Tableau. So we're a visual organization, go figure, right? We are good at interpreting things and getting meaning out of well-designed, beautiful objects, sight lines, and we've been able to really take this strength in visual recognition and interpretation to use a product like Tableau to communicate a lot of those very complex underlying quantitative concepts in an intuitive way. So here's how we've done it. It's not the most technically sound, but conceptually, we have internal data from all areas of the organizations: ticketing, membership, our development group, fundraising, et cetera. Our collections data, which I think is one of the most fascinating things that we have to work with. Our educational programmings, the museum shop, where we have both sales data, supply chain information, and finance. Analytics are good for numbers. We take that, we are big into data warehousing, we use SQL Server, and then a combo that we see a lot, the Alteryx Tableau link. So Alteryx to lean out our data blending and our data processing, and Tableau to create repeatable, great interactive visualization. But this has kind of been the blueprint for every success that we've had, and failures, admittedly, that we've had too in our adventures in applying data for decision making at the museum. But what's been great about this too, given our resource constraints and our relative newness to the process, it's something that we've been able to really scale well with limited cost and time. So the first question that really sparked all this, I remember I was sitting in a meeting, and the question was, well, our attendance went up because of X, or our attendance went down because of Y. And I remember looking at this guy across the room who has since become my partner in this work. We're both thinking, we'd have to assume that a visitor from England is following the same schedule and has the same drivers as a visitor from the West Loop. And that just didn't seem right. But we wanted to get to the bottom of this. So, and getting to know this guy, Matt Norris, my executive director of analytics, who couldn't be here, and we started to figure out, what can we learn about attendance? And it's important, right? Attendance drives all of our operating revenue, basically. So ticket sales, memberships, museum shop, we need to get feet in the door to get that part of our business stabilized. But we didn't know exactly what drives it, right? Is it exhibition? Is it tourism patterns to Chicago? Is it price? Is it programming? Is it weather? Events in the city? There's a number of different factors. And when you think about our visitor base, we're a global museum, right? We get visitors from all over the world. So this is just a relative distribution with a threshold set, so it's clean. But you see we get visitors from Europe, from Asia, from South America, from North America, from across the United States and every state, and then within Illinois, we get a huge density from both Chicago, the suburbs, et cetera. So we started out with the hypothesis that within all of this noise, there are some similarities to different groups of visitors that we can understand, that we can quantify, and that we can use to rationally understand if something happened that caused a significant change in our attendance for better or worse. So looking at this is 5 years of weekly data. The bars are exhibitions. The beige bars are popular exhibitions. One will rank as a level 4, where we believe it has a little bit of extra something, whether it be popularity, accessibility, object recognition that brings more people in the door, and then gray, which are more scholarly exhibitions that still, we believe, had a bit of a lift. You see some seasonality, you see some changes with the exhibition, you just see some natural variation, but it's a little bit all over the place. It's hard to really understand what's going on. So the first thing we did, thinking about what data we had to work with, we're brand new, we have some Tableau licenses, and we have SQL. Figured, let's look at our attendance patterns. We capture zip code, so let's just look at geographic segments by channel and see if there's some similarities. And we actually were able to do this pretty easily. So this is the segmentation we now use from a geographic standpoint. What's interesting, out of everything on this page, visitors from the city of Chicago behave differently than the visitors from the suburbs of Chicago, which is not something we thought we were going to see. It allows us to focus more of our efforts within the city with a thought of, it seems like they're making them, we have more impact on the decisions for a city visitor than a suburban visitor. But also by grouping it this way, you can now start to isolate the groups and look for patterns. And there's a couple that jumped out right away. So first, the US fly market for us is seasonal. So if you pull back, that's a sine wave. You see some lift in exhibitions, particularly Van Gogh. We think that one moved the needle a little bit. But overall, this looks like we rise and fall with tourism, particularly tourism to Chicago. We didn't yet have a way to prove that, but at least just visually, like, wait a second, maybe tourists just come because we're a great organization. Whereas member visits, we've always thought these were driven by exhibitions, and we underestimated how driven they are by exhibitions. So you see this almost a step pattern with certain patterns like a bump in attendance at the end of a major exhibition, and if it's just flat attendance overall when there isn't one. But again, just by visualizing, we didn't have any math underneath this yet, but it was a way to help us communicate that, wow, there are differences and there are discernible patterns within this larger group. But we weren't satisfied with that. So what do you do? How do you know if an action you're taking actually moves the needle? And like I said, we're a resource-limited organization. We need to be smart about changes we make because we don't have a ton of room for experimentation or a ton of room for error. So this was our first attempt at some advanced modeling, which worked out pretty well at the end. We separated out into factors we can control, so looking at ticketing, membership, and other internal data to be represented those factors that we thought we had a handle on, and then factors we can't control. So tourism to Chicago, we can get that through an external vendor. City event schedules, we get that from the city, and weather data, you can get that as well. Funny story about weather, it turns out that we had one situation where we saw just a significant jump in attendance year over year. It turns out the attendance bottomed out one year because of the polar vortex we had. We had like 3 visitors coming to the museum with Valentine's Day overlapping that same week the following year. But thanks to the math, we didn't overreact. But what we did is took all these factors, there are about 200 total. We tested it in a multivariate regression model, simplified it to about 20 factors, but then we need to come up with a visual way to communicate this. So when you say statistical significance in an art museum, eyes glaze over really, really, really fast. Here's an example of what we came up with. And I'll go to the live dashboard, not live, it's live-ish. This is what we came up with. And we came up with this probably about 2 years ago, and we still use it today. We broke this up into 3 parts. So using that multivariate regression model, we were able to come up with an expected attendance by week. So think of it as like a rational baseline, that's in the blue. We have the actual attendance in red. We have the different segments, both by ticketed and member visits over on the side. There's separate models coming together to show this visual. We then stole a trick from the manufacturing industry and used what we'll call a control chart. So rather than show error bars or try to calculate the p-value, we decided to visualize it. So here, this represents an error based on standard deviations from the norm. But what we did is, if there is a solid circle, everything's fine. If it's not a solid circle, something happened, whether it's good or bad. We don't know exactly what factor, but it says, look at this right here. We have different symbols. As is for different audience. Some folks like to know why there's statistical significance. Some people don't care, but this way they're both taken care of. And then we have the table, because we still like tables. Can't visualize everything, especially being in the finance function. We really like tables there. So it's all on one shot. We just have to hit a button. It updates. And at the beginning of each week, we can see, did something happen that we need to think about for better or worse? What this represents, this is Van Gogh's bedrooms. We anticipated in our factors for the model that Van Gogh would be on par with our biggest exhibitions of the last 5 years. We didn't think it would be our biggest exhibition of the last 15 to 20 years. With 1 week, and I didn't know this was mathematically possible, we were 9 standard deviations above expectations. Like, that was bonkers. But what's interesting is this gave us a way to see, from a budgeting standpoint, from a forecasting standpoint, something really big is happening here. Now, we've also turned this model, we've inverted it to use it for forecasting. We're still working out the kinks with that, but it's been super helpful to simplify our communication, make sure we're all looking at the same thing, and also save a ton of time internally, not chasing variation that just doesn't matter to the business. Now, probably our biggest win on this came from the #1 museum in the world ranking. So when this came out, we were all excited, right? Like, when you're #1 at something, that's a good thing. We didn't know what to do. Like, well, should we just smile and nod? Should we call TripAdvisor? Should we make a big deal out of it? So we called the press. Hey, Chicago Tribune, you should talk about this. And it got a lot of local attention. You know, like in Chicago, we like champions. Go Cubs, right? But what we saw in the model is there was a break in our local ticketed attendance. In that first week, we saw a pretty significant jump, and that carried on through the end of the holiday season, which is not normally a busy time for us from local attendance. And this is net revenue. Like, museums aren't in a great place right now to be growing net revenue through attendance. This showed we were doing it, and we had something to work with in the #1 museum ranking. We pivoted that to be our marketing campaign for the following year. So rather than talk about an exhibition, we talked about being the best, complete with foam fingers and everything. It was wild. What we saw is we moved the needle both with local and tourist ticketed attendance once the tourism season picked up the following April. In total, this was over $2 million net increase, which for us is about 10 to 20%. That's a big deal in 1 year with no additional work. And it was the moment where this was our evangelism moment. So folks that weren't quite into data and analytics saw this, like, whoa, we could really move our business forward with minimal effort using simply communicated knowledge. And lots of guts behind this, but all I need to do is look for when that solid circle turns to a different symbol and ask the right questions. So we've taken this across the entire museum. So we started this work 2 to 3 years ago. We now have it linked to ticketed attendance, member attendance, joins and renewals, exhibition attendance, and shop sales. And it's all linked to attendance. We have the math to put these things together. In our dream world, we have almost a universal model for visitor revenue, where we can really start to make rational decisions about what we pursue, what we don't. But for now, this has just really changed the way we think about things, and I think has both improved the offering for the visitor while helping us both operationally and financially. So that was the big one. So flash forward, we're feeling good about understanding our attendance, and we're seeing what else we can tackle. So what about our operations? So what if we move from revenue and visitation into operations around our most mission-critical asset, which is the collection. So in the same time as we were going through the #1 Museum in the World campaign, we're also undergoing a major initiative across the museum to get more of our objects in the galleries online. One of the issues we struggle with as a museum are folks recognize our works. They don't necessarily associate them with the Art Institute or Chicago. So we need to improve our online presence. What we were struggling with was our reporting. So a lot of the work was being done on individual spreadsheets, being scheduled manually, and just taking pictures of what we could at any given point in time. So the way we structure our collections data, we're very lucky in this regard. We've built our own collection management system. It's been in-house since the 90s. We call it City. It's a front end that lays on top of 4D, which is a different type of database. Not too familiar with the underpinnings, but we've heard it's used a lot in supermarkets. Great at storing data, not great at pulling it out. Meanwhile, we have this setup of SQL to Tableau. So we decided, you know what? Why don't we see if we can build a link and turn our inventory management tool into a reporting tool? It seems to be working well for one side of the business. Let's see what we can do with the other. This is actually simpler data, right? We're just looking at object counts, artist counts, location. It worked really well. It was awesome. So what we've done is we've taken Tableau and made it the reporting front end for our collections database, and minimal work. I don't have a live shot of this. The data gets too wild behind the scenes to trust it in this format. But here what you're seeing is a shot earlier in the week of objects in the gallery. So we have about 5,300 objects on display right now. This number is going to be different if we refresh the data. We have counts by galleries. Gallery 15, that's actually our paperweight gallery. So if you didn't know, we have one of the world's largest collection of paperweights. So if you come in, go right down the stairs. It's by the miniature rooms, which everyone loves those. But what's great about this is just by putting some simple filters and a flat chart, we're able to isolate what galleries we were having issues with. So where did we have objects in the galleries that weren't being imaged? Were there certain departments or certain object types? What's driving the lag? We actually saw, with no additional staff and just this front end, we saw a 2 to 3x increase in productivity. And we went from the high 60s to 99% of our objects in the galleries on display within 6 months. So we're really, really excited about the results we saw. Again, with minimal cost, just some bootstrapping behind the scenes, and simple visualization that worked for the end user. So we've gotten more objects online. Here we go. So you see that we have, oh, that's interesting. Oh, because they need that up. There you go. So we have, we'll figure that out. So right now, last time we pulled this, we have 52 objects in the galleries not online with an image. And it's isolated a couple departments, but when looking at those are rotations. So we can just go in, shoot them, we're done, move on. But this happens on a weekly basis, and our imaging teams have access to this and just are able to manage the project without additional resources, additional support, and in an easy way that limits the amount of excess activity. Beyond getting the objects online, getting clean data, and being able to see it, it's also enabled, I think it's one of our coolest new digital platforms. We're making a big effort to improve our apps, as well as this. This is called Journey Maker. In a lot of our customer research, we saw that navigation of our building was a sore spot. Folks couldn't find the works they wanted to see. This is our first, we call it a bespoke navigation tool, which I'll just play this and let you guys see it. I think it's just really, really awesome. If you talk about just data visualization and getting to your audience, we couldn't have done that a year ago. Now we can take all of this back of the house work and give our audience something that translates the digital to the physical medium, to take visitors to new areas of the museum they didn't know existed, and to create a platform that, again, we don't believe any museum can do something like this, and a lot of it is due to data. So where we're moving next, and we are members of the art history community, right? So we always are looking to understand more about our collections, not just in a financial setting or a visitor-facing setting. What we've done is used this approach of visualizing our collections data through Tableau to just understand how our collections have grown over time. Where are their strengths? Where are their gaps? Are there ways that we can codify knowledge that somebody new to the organization can just pick it up and know how the museum has gotten to the point it's at, and how to communicate these insights in a visual way for all audiences? This is my personal favorite. I've spent about the last year working with different collection committees to work through a visual representation of the collection data. This is our modern contemporary collection over time. I thought it was just fascinating as you see these trends when a certain type of media comes into the collection. Some of them grow over time, painting and sculpture obviously, but also photography, new media, so audio and video. And as we think about this, when we see the growth, that has major strategic implications of how do we invest in ways to store the collection, conserve the collection, and plan around resource allocation for acquisition. So again, there's no fancy math. This is just visualizing data that exists, but it's a new way to communicate it that has unlocked a ton of knowledge and great engagement from the folks we've worked with on this. So we've come a long way in the last several years. So we've done attendance modeling, which core concepts communicate in a simple way. We've looked at our collections data, so taking very simple visualization, but with a more mission-based slant and something that's unique to our organization. Ultimately, one of our holy grail objectives is understanding which audience segments we're reaching with different programs, not just through the museum or general admission, but for a particular effort, are we getting to those types of individuals that we hope to engage? So we started off a long ways back looking at a Chicagoland segmentation. So if we take everybody in Chicago, can we segment in ways such as location, a favorable view of the visual arts, understanding more about how large groups of people in Chicago communicate or receive marketing messages, et cetera. And we successfully got there, and it was a good first step. We're setting up a framework, but it wasn't very actionable. We then took this into a museum segmentation. So taking what we know about Chicagoland, laying it on top of what we know about the museum, and getting more specific. Again, we had a way to understand what types of visitors were coming into the museum and how they like to experience it. But it was hard to take that knowledge and go back out. So what we've tried to do now is get to almost a channel segmentation. So for different types of offering, can we understand what visitors are coming in and how to use that knowledge to go back out into Chicagoland to understand where else similar audiences may reside to help direct marketing efforts, partnership selection, digital communications, et cetera. Now, if you asked me 2 years ago, the amount of work it would have taken to get to a channel segmentation would have been unwieldy. It took us weeks, well, it actually took us several months to do the Chicagoland segmentation, several weeks to do the museum segmentation, both high cost with many dedicated resources. Thanks to the combination of Tableau and Alteryx and knowledge we've built up internally with our lean team, we flipped the practicality, and we think we're getting close to this idea of channel segmentation. So we focused our initial work in this on membership, and we selected membership for several reasons. We've done a ton of work in trying to optimize the membership pipeline. So to understand renewal probability based on member behavior, that was an early effort by my colleague Matt. We've looked at ways to lean out the communication process to remove expenses that we don't need with less effective mailings, outreach, et cetera, and focusing on what matters most. But we also have very robust data on members. So we figure, well, if we're going to try something new, might as well go with the best stuff we have. So we first, going down to census block level, we identified the census blocks within Chicagoland that were above a threshold that we selected for high membership penetration. So if we think about Chicagoland, this is where our members tend to reside. Completely experience-based, but just visualizing this as a first step was really great in getting people on board. So this is where we're kind of treading into uncharted territory. So we used machine learning, thanks to the Alteryx product, to train an algorithm to predict core segments using demographic and psychographic data. So if we take those areas that we think, by census block, have high membership penetration, can we figure out what the similarities are and then use that to predict where members, what other areas may have potential for membership acquisition or renewal? So we validated our scheme against membership penetration. This was the exciting one. It was like, oh my God, it works, right? So what you see, and this is a scatter plot, our scoring is on the x-axis, the penetration of members is on the y-axis, and the red dots are what the algorithm said are in that core segment, so that we would pursue to find the members. And our initial threshold of 6% wasn't too far off, but you see there's definitely red dots outside of that clump. We're just really excited that with minimal work, not months, not weeks, not days, but hours, we were able to develop a segmentation schema that seems to work. And then using our scoring system, if you go beyond that core group, what's the next most likely group? What's the next? What's the next? So you can take on a strategy both of focusing on the segment that matters most, but then experimenting with those that are on the periphery to see if you can bring them into the core group. But to do this with extreme precision and much more rationality than we have in the past. And when we applied this to Chicagoland, just some very interesting observations came up. So what you see here, this is the intersection. I'm not sure who here is from Chicagoland, if anybody. We have the intersection of Oak Park and Berwyn, which are both growing west suburbs that are immediately adjacent to the city. We've always seen great performance from Oak Park, but never went deep on it. And the algorithm is telling us, so here's why. So you see most of Oak Park is in the red, those that are defined as our core segments. Otherwise, dark blue, lighter blue, and those that are on the periphery based on our scoring. But then with Berwyn, which we've never seen great performance despite it being adjacent, the algorithm is saying, you might have a harder time converting individuals from this region. But this helps us direct our efforts, but with a very, very low effort approach. And I think this is great for membership renewal, membership onboarding, revenue generation, all that's wonderful. But I think what really sets this apart and where we're just beyond excited is there's nothing stopping us from taking this approach into our mission-driven programs. It doesn't have to be about money. As long as we have information about participants, we could use this to set dedicated segmentation schema and rationally test how can we grow participation in anything we do. So affiliate group programs, this is After Dark, so this is an event stemmed from membership and giving younger professionals a way to engage with the museum a little bit differently. Our lectures and performances, we have an exceptional portfolio of lectures and performances every year, some free, some paid, but it's how we communicate scholarship around the collection and give, again, people a new way to engage and view the museum. Family programming, school tours, and community outreach, and all three of those are critical, and they're all areas where we're not aware of anybody using these types of techniques to prove that these work or do not work, but we're really excited to move in that direction and see what happens. So that's the last 3 years in a nutshell at the Art Institute using data and analytics. And just, we learned a lot. So coming from the consulting world, it was always about how do you structure an analysis, how do you get the numbers right, and how do you present it the right way. But working with an organization that has resource constraints, has a culture that is not familiar with this way of working, but with extreme talent and willingness to learn. This is a summary of what worked for us. So first, play to the strengths. If we didn't communicate visually, we would have been dead in the water right out of the gate. We were fortunate enough to get the right visuals in front of the right audiences for all of these applications. And those applications that haven't gotten the same traction that these three have, that's one of the things that didn't always work out right. We just didn't communicate it in a way that that worked well with the decision maker. We try to only pick questions that matter. If you're in an organization that has more resources and more time than we do, great. Analysis for analysis' sake is okay. We can't afford to do that. So we have to pick those things that matter to the business. But as a result, I think we also have stacked the deck in answering those questions that the largest number of individuals in the museum want to know the answers to. Lean processes or bust. This was something that I learned, and my colleague has been great at keeping me honest with. Given our desire to scale in a resource-sensitive way, the implementation of these is just as important as coming up with that first answer. And that's been, for things like the attendance model and now with the segmentation, the ability to replicate with minimal effort is really, really important. Remembering the personal element. Now, cultural change through insight is something we all struggle with, right? Sometimes you learn some uncomfortable truths, and it's not always just about getting the right answer. It's making sure that answer is communicated at the right speed with the right language and presents it in a way where the knowledge is seen as beneficial. You never want to seem like you're attacking somebody when working through some uncomfortable truths, and we've had some of those. We've also had some tremendous successes, right? But it's just kind of the Pandora's box of analytics on an organization that hasn't seen it before. And probably the most important going forward, practical is better than perfect, right? Like, not all this, the data is good enough. We can make decisions off it. We believe in it. We believe the trends are right. There are still going to be gaps. There's always going to be that number that's not quite there, or the data point that is just a little bit off. We've optimized for moving quicker and making decisions than perfecting the analysis, and that's what's allowed us to move as fast as we have. So with that, thank you. I appreciate your time this morning, and happy to answer any questions you might have about this work.
Anyone? A mic here for you.
So you talk about
here.
truths.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind using this? Oh, sorry.
Can you give us an example of where preconceived notions, maybe of the management, senior management said, we're going to go this way, and the data said, we got to take a right turn?
Yeah, so probably the most notable, and we're still wrestling with this, is the issue of price. So one thing that did not come out as a significant factor in our attendance modeling is ticket price. And we've undergone a couple increases in ticket price and put in a supplemental charge for the Van Gogh exhibition while seeing attendance continue to grow. Now, there is a limit to that because we have the mission component of our organization. I think that's been probably the biggest surprise, and where you start to see, for the work that has gone as far as this, where you see a passionate opinion on both sides of the issue, and frankly, one that I could see both sides. Financially, excellent. Mission-wise, we also need to be very careful and sensitive to it. So that's probably the biggest.
Can you talk a little bit more about your process in deciding on the right visual? Was there a lot of back and forth, or what were some of the things that you guys went through to get to the final visual?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The beauty of a product like Tableau is the iterative nature. So we'd start with my team just working through a bunch of different approaches. And I think in our group, so myself, my colleague Matt, and we've now expanded a bit for other folks who are now using Tableau. We'll just get in a room and try a bunch of things out to have a couple different options that we think would work. Then we'll bring in a stakeholder in an informal way to then keep prototyping different visuals until we figure out something that works. Once we figure out that thing that works, then we think about the right channel of communication. It may still be in Tableau. It may be translated into reporting services through SQL Server. It may be something else entirely. And then sticking with those dashboards that really resonated with the person who has to own them going forward. But lots of iteration and lots of failed attempts that I didn't show in the presentation.
Hi, I follow the Art Institute on social media, and they have a really active social media team, it seems. And are you able to connect any of that data to your attendance models and things? Like, is that impact?
It's a great question. So we've invested in online ticketing capabilities over the past year. So we have a new platform with a new ticketing system that we've seen tremendous growth just because our previous system wasn't quite up to par. I think one of the things that I'd love to do, and it may not be to the attendance model, we haven't seen online ticketing or conversion from social media to online ticketing move the overall needle of attendance. But that being said, it's a treasure trove of data. It's easy to look at. And one of the things is that conversion from social media into online ticket purchase, definitely on my list. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Have you done any comparisons against public transportation models and seeing how that would influence where your different sectors are?
We have not. Our biggest factor that we know to date is the leisure traveler to Chicago through hotel room rates. The public transportation question, we thought about addressing that about 2 years ago and decided put on the back burner just because of the workload. But to your point, hadn't thought about that. There's different data sets out there that might let us look at that. That's a very, very good. Bring that back to the team.
Very important question. What do you foresee as the impact of the Cubs winning the World Series on attendance next year?
We're actually watching that at the request from several of our supporters. I think that we've done a really good job of tying ourselves to civic events in Chicago. So we've partnered with the Cubs on this, with the hats on the Lions and an ongoing communication. I wouldn't put I'm curious to see if it boosts overall attendance, but I do think that making sure we remain a relevant part of Chicago culture for local visitors is super critical. And if exposure as part of the World Series run and the hats and the W sign pay off, even better. We're not banking on it, but we have the tools to watch it, and we're definitely doing that over the next several weeks.
Have you done any analysis of your exhibition schedule and the type of exhibitions you do based on data and changed anything?
So we don't select exhibitions based on the data. What we do is we first select the exhibitions based on importance to the field and what we're trying to communicate about the art. But what we do have is a better understanding through this model what different exhibitions may do in terms of marginal attendance lift by segment. So some will have a better lift over the summer if we see through the data they have appeal to tourists. Others may be able to boost member attendance independent of the time of year. I think a big surprise for us with some of this work is exhibitions in the late winter, early spring, such as Picasso in Chicago and Van Gogh's Bedrooms, have performed exceptionally well, with the previous notion being it has to be in the summer to be successful, and our data doesn't suggest that at all.
Anyone else?
Going back a little bit to the public transportation question, that neighborhood division that you showed, did you talk about exploring non-museum data to find the correlates of what's driving that? So public transportation, other neighborhood variables, geographic spatial data?
So we use, so the question is, if I get this right, have we used other external data sets to understand that the Chicagoland segmentation showed later in the presentation? So we bring in census data, geospatial data. We haven't yet brought in public transportation data. And this is still, we're at the very early stages of this. And what's great, again, with the tools that are available now, is we can continue to do that to see if it has an impact. I really love this push on the public transportation data. That's really not something we've explored too deeply so far. But yeah, the external data is critical to making this stuff work.
I read a recent article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy about measuring how long people were staying in each room and the flow. Is it your team that's doing that? And how are you visually showing it in Tableau?
So what we do, we aggregate Wi-Fi, the density of wireless devices in the museum using our Wi-Fi network. And what we can do with that is look at heat maps of aggregated visitor behavior through the museum. So for instance, we now know that it doesn't matter which entrance a visitor comes in. They're likely to take the same path. It's almost a super highway between the two entrances. We also can tell which galleries have the highest dwell time. So we don't get down to individual level. That's just, we don't need to do that. We don't want to cross that. But what we've been able to do is understand which are the most popular galleries, look for trends, and then use that to influence marketing messages, or to use the popularity of one room to then try to drive visitors to another less visited area of the museum that we believe still has potential to engage. We don't visualize in Tableau. We still use the platform that is provided by our network provider. But yeah, it's another data set that it's one of those ones we always think about, but just haven't brought it into this work yet.
I'd like to hear more about your membership data when it comes to churn and predictive analytics. If you are noticing a drop-off in your retention rates from year over year, I don't know how you measure your cycles. What type of corrective action would you take if you start to notice your membership, renewals start to drop? And are you using Tableau for that?
So we did not use Tableau for that. It's a lot of manual modeling, so to speak. So we saw visitation as the biggest factor to influence renewal probability throughout the year, and it's by far the most predictive factor. We have several others, but what we'll do is we will send additional offers and extra mailing, something to promote that marginal visit from a member that is in that, from a probability standpoint, kind of in the battleground. Like we're not going to spend a lot of resources going after someone with, say, a 10% or less chance of renewal, nor a 90% or higher chance of renewal. We're going to focus our energy on the middle band. But there's a lot more complexity, but it all comes down to how do we get a member to set foot in the museum one more time throughout the year? And we've simplified it to that goal.
Do you have any tips on how to overcome some of the challenges of bringing data to an organization that's not used to working that way?
Yes, keep it simple, positive, and find a quick win. It's really, really important off the bat, before there is an impression formed, whether positive or negative, to keep that impression as positive as possible. So it goes back to, for us, attendance was so critical and something we've tried to answer in many different ways. That's why we picked that as, we were fortunate that it kind of fell in our lap, but also why we felt comfortable really pursuing that. Whereas the segmentation work, granted there are technical limitations, but it also has the potential to be much more complex in terms of communicating the message and getting buy-in across the organization. So if you're just starting out, really listen to what questions people are asking. What's that bit of knowledge that'll really get them hooked? And then how do you come up with something simple enough where they see the value without being put off by it, if that makes sense. These are all great questions, by the way. Thank you. All right. Awesome. Thank you, everybody.